Okay, this is my session 5 video project. Here in the audience is my wife Jennifer.
Hi.
She will be following along. She has a copy of the PowerPoint that I'm going to be using for this video. So, as I said, she can follow along and learn a thing or two. Anyway, my this video is going to be on something currently in the news and is controversial. It's the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which happened on February the 24th of 2022, when 190,000, approximately, give or take, Russian troops attacked on multiple axes and began to take large portions of territory within the country of Ukraine. Now, by way of introduction, I'm going to address in this introduction mainly the perception that has been shaped through the Western media, through the United States government, and through the mainstream media, both in this country, the United Kingdom, and largely in the West in general, which is why I'll just use the term Western media from this point out. The idea that's been kind of shaped and formed and fostered within the public sphere, the public mind, is that the Russian invasion was unprovoked, that Putin is a madman, that he's basically akin to Hitler himself, that he has imperialist ambitions, and that anything coming out of the Kremlin or Moscow, which is the capital of Russia, anything coming out of there is just lies. So the idea that's been formed is also that Ukraine is a democracy just like us, and they're just bleeding and aching to be just a Western democracy in the same way that we are, or the same way that the United Kingdom is, or France or Germany. They just want to join this modern world of democracy and liberalism and all these kinds of things. And that's the general idea, that this is unprovoked. Ukraine is just like us. There are our Slavic brothers, and that Russia is just fulfilling Putin's kind of wet dream, his fantasy that Russia return to its Soviet era boundaries. In other words, he's empire building. This invasion is just a land grab, and his talk about Ukraine joining NATO as being an existential threat and all this kind of stuff, that those are all just lies. And so it's been framed in a very good versus evil dichotomy, where nothing Russia does is good or justified, and everything we do, no matter what it is, or Ukraine, whatever they do, is good and justified, and we just turn a blind eye if there's anything negative whatsoever. Now, I would suggest to you that all of that is a lie. None of that is true. This is not a case of good versus evil in any clear kind of sense. The conflict, or the crisis that erupted in 2022, didn't just happen out of nowhere. Just anyone who believes that hasn't studied history in any depth whatsoever. No event just happens. No country just attacks another country and commits large numbers of its forces into another country, willing to receive, mass casualties and so forth, just because I just wanted to take that country. It just doesn't. Even Hitler didn't do things quite like that. It wasn't as that simple. Even Hitler's invasion of Russia was not that. It was a land grab, but there was also a whole nother side of it where he had to have the Russian oil and other things like that. And so there was an economic aspect to it as well. Not justifying it, I'm just saying. But anyway, getting back to the topic on hand, there's a couple things that need to be defined and kind of said by way of preface. The first is, what is NATO? NATO is an alliance with the United States as its head. It's an alliance of Western countries like like England, France, Germany, and now Finland and Sweden, and prospectively Ukraine and another country called Georgia. NATO was formed back when Russia was the Soviet Union, which was a communist nation, and NATO's its nature and its only reason for existence was to counter Russia. And so that's the only reason it was formed, was to counter the Soviet Union, to contain it, and to provide an alliance between countries which could fight militarily against it if one of them was attacked. And so, like NATO has what's called Article 5, where if you attack a NATO country, then all the NATO countries come together, and you're not just fighting one NATO country, you're fighting all of them. So if Russia were to attack, say, Poland right now, today, that would trigger Article 5. And we, the United States, would then be at war with Russia, along with all of the rest of NATO. Now, that's what NATO is. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, and this is important to understand the basic history of this thing, when the Soviet Union collapsed in the early 1990s, the president of Russia was Gorbachev. And when Gorbachev negotiated the withdrawal of Soviet troops from parts of Europe back into the boundaries that we would now call Russia today, part of his negotiated agreement for withdrawal with the United States and with NATO was that NATO would not expand its borders eastward or towards the Russian borders. So, for example, NATO would not take into its alliance countries like Ukraine, like Georgia, like Finland, like Sweden, which, by the way, Finland and Sweden just joined NATO in direct contradiction to that agreement. Ukraine has been seeking to join NATO for quite some time, and Georgia, this little country, tried to join NATO. So anyway, the agreement was NATO will not expand eastward, and it's done exactly that for decades now. And the Russians have kept saying for a long time now, stop. You can't take that country into NATO. And then we take that country into NATO, and then the next one, and then the next one. And it's just, my argument would be that it's gotten to a boiling point that with Ukraine. Okay. So anyway, in Georgia, there's a little country called Georgia, and this is just a fascinating little example that also borders Russia like Ukraine does, and it sought to join NATO. Well, our diplomats went over there and visited with the Georgian president and said, "Hey, yeah, we'd like to have you join NATO as well." Well, the Russians said, "No, you can't do that. NATO's a hostile alliance. It's the only reason it exists is to counter our country, to contain it. It's not a positive thing for us. And so you can't integrate a country that's on our border into NATO. That's a red line for us. You can't do it." And they did it. They attempted to do it anyway. They kept encouraging Georgia to join NATO, and Georgia said, "Oh, okay, we'll do it." Well, then Putin, shock of all shocks, invaded Georgia and defeated their military, destroyed half the country, and so now they can't join NATO because one of the requirements for joining NATO is that your country not be in a state of turmoil. Well, Georgia's destroyed, then can't join NATO. Same thing's happening with Ukraine today. Okay, so moving on. Here's a quote from Professor John J. Mearsheimer. Now, Mearsheimer is one of the leading geopolitical scholars out there today. He's recognized as, an expert on geopolitical thinking, and he's written quite a number of books on this crisis, the Russian-Ukraine crisis, and many other books. And what he says is the taproot, quote, "The taproot of the current crisis is NATO expansion and Washington, that's us, Washington's commitment to move Ukraine out of Moscow's orbit and integrate it into the West." Major Scott Ritter, who is also a former UN weapons inspector to Iraq, says that, quote, "Russia has been duped into believing there was a diplomatic solution to the violence that had broken out there's a region in Ukraine called the Donbass. That's where all the fighting is going on. Solution to the violence that had broken out in the Donbass region of eastern Ukraine in the aftermath of the 2014 US-backed Maidan coup in Kiev." And what he's referencing is, in 2014, our government paid protesters and militia groups to oust a pro-Russian president in Ukraine who had been elected, democratically elected. We didn't like him. We didn't want him in there. And so we paid protesters and rioters and separatist groups to force him out of office. And then we installed somebody that was on our side. And so this is just more evidence that the the provoking and the the antagonization has all been done by us in regards to Russia's relationship with Ukraine. When Ukraine democratically elects a leader that we just don't like, because he's pro-Russian, then we pay protesters and separatist groups and militias to force him out. The most anti-democratic thing you can do, and yet we claim we're fighting the war in the name of democracy. It's ridiculous. um, that brings us to what Scott Ritter mentioned a second ago, which is the Donbass, and that the Donbass is a region in eastern Ukraine. It's where all the fighting's going on right now, currently, and it's the Donbass is largely, it's an area where the people there are largely Russian. They're not like the Ukrainians that are in the western part of Ukraine, who have become very Western in their attitude, their outlook. Those people in the West are a lot more like us. The people in the eastern part of Ukraine are ethnically Russians. They speak Russian. They're historically Russian people that have settled there. And since 2014, or actually 2008, probably, there has been tension and fighting between the Donbass region. They formed their own militias to protect their civilians. So their militias have been fighting the Ukrainian army, which we have funded and trained and given weapons and bombs and everything, have been fighting them since 2014 or before that. And the people in the Donbass have been crying out to Russia, saying, we need your help. The Ukrainians have been bombing Donetsk city, quite a number of civilian areas there for several years now. Civilians die all the time there from Ukrainian bombs, just indiscriminately shelling these cities. No military targets, just shelling the civilians, because there's antagonism between these Russian citizens, which is essentially what they are in the Donbass, and the Ukrainian people. Even though this technically was considered part of Ukraine, they view them as subhuman, the Ukrainians do. And I'm not going to get into that, but there is a lot of racial tension there. And so these people have been calling out to Putin saying, help us, send some assistance. We're being slaughtered by these bombs and everything. And that is part of why Putin went in. If you follow the news or anything that's been happening since he invaded, I think 4 or 5 last summer at some point, I think it was in September of last summer, there was a referendum where those provinces in the Donbass all voted on whether they would want to remain with Ukraine or join Russia and be officially considered Russian territory, where they voted almost unanimously. It was over 90%. That they would join Russia. And so now Russia views that Donbass area where all the fighting's going on as Russian territory. That's the motherland now. They're not invading, they're defending their territory now. So you begin to see how the situation is actually enormously complex. This is not just a case of good versus evil or imperialism versus democracy or any of this other nonsense. This is a tremendously complex situation. And just by the way, if you want to research anything I'm saying, if you're incredulous about it, or you just you have questions, you don't know anything about it, there are a few American journalists who have been reporting on the Ukrainian shelling of the civilians in the Donbass for many years now. One of them's names is Patrick Lancaster, and the other is Eva Bartlett. That's just to name two. There's also Ira Gonzalez, who's a Chilean American, if I pronounce that right. And so there are quite a few of people who have kind of in the underground, outside the mainstream media, been reporting on this. Um, the next thing I would say is that this war has absolutely nothing to do with Ukrainian democracy or preserving democracy in Ukraine. The Ukrainians are not a democracy. They're internationally recognized as one of the most corrupt countries on planet Earth. I think they were ranked at number 4 the last time I checked. Now, Russia is number 8, not much better, but they're more corrupt than Russia. They're an oligarchy, not a democracy. Almost all the press, the freedom of the press in Ukraine is gone. So the president of Zelensky has banned almost all of it. Now, as far as from our point of view, I would submit that this is actually, again, nothing to do with democracy, but is rather an American proxy war. Similar to what we did at the beginning of Vietnam, where we started backing the certain Vietnamese elements with funding, with missiles, with ammunition, with the goal of destroying somebody we didn't like. And I think that's what's going on here. It's not so much that we want to preserve Ukraine. I don't believe our government cares at all about Ukraine or our president or any of them. I think instead what's happening is that it's not so much they like Ukraine, it's that they don't like Russia. They don't like Putin. They don't like the nationalism over there. And they see them as an impediment to their expansion, our expansionist imperialist goals. And so you basically have two great powers that are fighting over Ukraine. And one of the nuggets of propaganda, if you follow this war at all, is that Ukraine, and this is a tragic side to it, is that Ukraine somehow winning the war. That's not remotely true. None of that is true. I followed this as intensely as I possibly can from somebody who's sitting in Pennsylvania, just reading up on it, But the people I listen to are military experts who have decades of service experience, and they're not paid to say anything. When you listen to, say, General Mark Milley, who's the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or Secretary of State Lloyd Austin, or any of the people in the White House, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, they are paid to say what they're saying. They're shaping perception. They're not really telling you what's going on the battlefield. That's just a fact. If you want to know what's actually going on in the battlefield, who's winning, who's losing, you have to go outside the mainstream sources and really talk to people who are just concerned, and they want to get the truth out there, and they're not being paid to say X, Y, to shape a narrative, to put forward a narrative or shape perception. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who's one of those great voices out there. Here's a quote from him. He said, "Ukraine is losing its war with Russia. Ukraine's hospitals and morgues are filled to capacity with wounded and dying Ukrainian soldiers." The estimates I've heard is that anywhere from 150 to 200,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. That's just the killed. That doesn't count the wounded, the missing in action, or the prisoners. The normal kill to death ratio in war is 1-3 or 1-4. So you're looking at anywhere close to 400 to 500,000 casualties on the Ukrainian side, and that number is only going up. So this isn't it's not even a war. It's a humanitarian crisis at this point, which is something Macgregor has said many times now. Now, moving on, I would say to put this at its most visceral for us would be, to think of ourselves living here in the United States. If China, let's say China started an alliance that was directly antagonistic to the United States. The only point of this alliance was to contain the United States, to limit its economic growth, and to contain its military. Let's say China did that. And then China went to Canada and Mexico and started putting military bases over there and started arming the Canadian and the Mexican militaries and started putting missiles up there and started talking about bringing these two nations who border the United States, Canada and Mexico, into this anti-United States alliance, an anti-American alliance. That's basically what's happening with NATO and Ukraine and Russia. Now, just think for yourself, how you would respond to that. First off, as a citizen, you and I would be alarmed that anything like that could possibly happen. And our first thought would be to cry out to our government and say, "How are you allowing this? You're a great military. The United States is a great power. How is it possible that you're allowing China to do this up in Canada, do this down in Mexico, and threaten us?" You know, because now you're threatening not only our military, but us, you and I. You know, our lives would then be in jeopardy. Our children's lives would be in jeopardy. Our security that we take for granted here in this country would be shattered. Let's just be honest, it would. And I don't think it's a stretch, and I don't think I have to concoct much of an argument to convince you that the first thing that the United States would do is try to tell China, "Hey, you need to stop doing this right away," which, by the way, Russia tried to do with NATO. Stop. You know, Ukraine and Georgia is a red line. You can't do that. So we would try to do that. If that failed and no negotiations could take place and China didn't care, what what do you think we would do? We would send our army in to Canada, we would send our army in to Mexico, and we would destroy the Chinese military presence there. You know, I don't see how I don't see any other scenario like that's even remotely possible. And beyond all that, our government has what's called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says that no other great power can exercise any kind of military authority in the Western Hemisphere. Okay. So we're basically saying that a country like Russia and China has no business with any kind of military power on our side of the world. Stay off our grass, stay off our lawn. But then Russia does not have the right. On the flip side, we're saying to Russia, then you don't have the right. You don't have the right to have the same a Monroe-esque type doctrine. It doesn't matter. You know, no matter what, we can tell countries to stay out of our side of our turf, but you can't do the same thing. And so this whole idea that you know we're defending Ukraine's sovereignty and their democracy, but yet we'll just trample upon Russia's is just ludicrous. Um, okay, so in summary, in conclusion, I would say that just to reiterate the things that I was saying is that from the very beginning that this complex is or this conflict, this crisis is enormously complex. It is not simple. It is not an issue of